All in the Family is a prehistory of the culture wars. It's an explanation for why in the last two generations our politics have been dominated by questions of women's roles in society, gender, sexuality, and the family. It really tries to explain how it is that since the 1960s, in the last half century, American politics were transformed by debates over the family. This has been central to how Americans think about politics, whether they're on the liberal and left side of the political spectrum or on the conservative right side of the political spectrum. So one of the things I talk about is how the American family was essential to a liberal politics between the New Deal of the 1930s and the 1960s. This is something I call breadwinner liberalism, right? This is the idea that American families required some assistance, some support. Social Security is perhaps the best example, but there are others. And that for a good 3 or 4 decades, a critical feature of liberal politics was a commitment to a particular kind of nuclear family, and especially a male breadwinner nuclear family. But what happened is in the 1960s, that liberal commitment went into crisis. It experienced a profound crisis because of the social movements that challenged that essential family from the left side of the political spectrum. So if you think about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, feminism, the various feminisms of that era, and eventually the gay and lesbian rights movements and other social movements that challenged the idea that there really is one male breadwinner model of the American family. When liberalism experienced those challenges, it went into a prolonged period of political crisis during the 1960s and well into the 1970s. And it's at that critical historical moment that the conservative movement steps into the breach with liberalism in crisis and proposes a kind of new model of the American family, one that does not require economic support or economic assistance, but one that requires moral protection. And so the book really tells the story of the politicized American family going from a family that needs support economically to one that needs protection morally. That's how I characterize the shift from a liberal political culture to a more conservative political culture. The critical difference between the pre-1960s liberal model of the family and the post-1970s conservative model of the family really comes down to, as one might expect, the role of the state, the role of our collective empowerment through the national government, the role that plays in our lives. In a liberal model of the family, families require some modicum of basic economic security, and the government, the national state and state level governments play an important role in providing resources to families, providing a social safety net for families, and so on. That's part of that liberal model of family itself. For conservatives, the idea of a family that needs not economic protection, but rather moral protection, that speaks to a very different role for government, right? In this model, government's job is not to help support families economically, but rather to prevent them from experiencing or from coming into contact with an immoral society. So something like, we can take the example of reproductive rights or abortion as perhaps the most critical example. For many conservatives, this is simply an immoral process, an immoral act, and government's job should be to prevent it. And that's a legitimate role for government as conservatives see it. The reason the 1960s is so important to this story, it looks a little bit like this. If you think about the liberal politicians, the notable liberal politicians of that earlier era, someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, these were political figures who believed in what we now would call the traditional family. They believed in a male breadwinner family, the male largely responsible for supporting the family economically, and so on. That was really still part of the liberal idea, and that idea was challenged in the 60s particularly by feminism and by the gay and lesbian rights movement, but also in some interesting ways by the civil rights and Black Power movements, who essentially said that model of the family is heterosexual, it's patriarchal, it's white, and so on. That it doesn't really represent the full breadth of American families and the way that Americans actually live their lives. And that was a deep challenge to liberalism itself, and it's one of the precipitating events, one of the precipitating forces that creates this crisis in liberalism in the 1960s. It's not by any means the only one, but it's a pretty major one. One of the most interesting examples that I use in the book, and I think one of the most critical hinges of this transformation that I trace, is arguments over subsidized childcare in the 1970s. And here we really see a battle between the forces on the liberal left over definitions of the family and forces on the emerging, but really not yet powerful conservative right. This happened in 1971. Congress passed a comprehensive Child Development Act, a comprehensive child care act that provided large subsidies for child care in the United States. And it was in response to a very strong grassroots political movement that proposed child care as essential to the lives of working women. Congress passed it. It was sent to President Nixon's desk for signature. And it was the first real moment in national politics that we see an eruption of grassroots response on the right. The Nixon White House received thousands and thousands of letters. Pat Buchanan, who was an advisor to Nixon in those days, understood that emerging grassroots movement, communicated its message to Nixon, and the message was subsidized childcare threatens the traditional model of the family. It threatens the traditional idea of strong mothers and strong motherhood, and the president should veto it. And in fact, Nixon did veto that Child Care Act in 1971. That's a very interesting moment, and it's one that doesn't usually register on our collective memories of that era, but it's a critical turning point in these politics. Another critical hinge of this transformation that All in the Family tracks takes place really in the late 1970s. That's when we see the birth of the so-called pro-family or family values movement. That movement came most immediately out of the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and the fight of a conservative activist named Phyllis Schlafly, who many people are familiar with and still an activist today in a lot of ways. Her opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment in the mid and late 1970s helped to galvanize a movement that named itself the pro-family movement. And then that movement, which ultimately became the so-called family values movement, was critical to the Reagan coalition that came together in 1980. The lens of the family actually turns up some startling and surprising discoveries in this period as well. So something like the Vietnam War, which we might not ordinarily associate with the politics of the family. I have a whole chapter in All in the Family about the war and the way that battles over manhood and the responsibilities of men became critical to the way that Americans argued about Vietnam. And if you think about it, it makes sense. On the one hand, you have conservative Americans, or Americans who saw themselves as deep patriots in the 1970s, and they believed that men's responsibility was to be drafted, to go into the military service, to serve their country, to stand when called, as it were. But there were other Americans who believed that a man's duty was to stand up to what they perceived to be an immoral war, right? That there was a moral calling for American men to resist the draft, to resist what they saw as an immoral war. So much of the debates over Vietnam at the level of the individual family came down to what was a male citizen's real responsibility. How does that play out in the political arena? I wrote All in the Family, I think, in some ways for two reasons. One is a deeply personal one, and one is a more professional and scholarly one. The deeply personal one is that I'm a child of this era. I'm a child of the 1970s. I came up in the shadow of all of these fights and struggles, and in many ways, the repercussions of those struggles shaped me growing up. And so I had a very intense desire to understand what it was that shaped my own childhood, that shaped my parents, that shaped the world in which I grew up. So that's the personal reason. The scholarly and professional reason is that there have been many studies of the 1960s and 70s and many studies of the 1980s, but these are often treated separately. The 60s has its own kind of cast. It's the period of liberal rebellion or radicalism, the anti-war movement, and so on. But there aren't a lot of studies that really try to tell the whole story of the 1960s to the present through a single lens. And the lens of the family works quite well in organizing and helping us to understand the way that American politics has changed since the 1960s. The argument of All in the Family is unique, but it really builds on the work of a generation of historians. And of course, that's, as a professional historian, this is how we produce work. We stand on the shoulders of our colleagues, other scholars, and we use their work, but we strike out also in new directions. So All in the Family is based on really a generation of work on the welfare state, on gender and sexuality and the welfare state, and also a generation of work now on conservatism. But All in the Family takes a lot of that work, adds the original research that I spent 5 years doing, and it strikes out in a kind of new organizational framework, or provides a new framework for understanding the last 50 years of American politics. The research in the book really extends from the presidential memo to the grassroots manifesto. So I have done research in the presidential archives, the presidential libraries of every president since JFK. And I've also done extensive research in the files and documents and collections of grassroots politics, everything from the National Organization for Women, various gay and lesbian rights organizations, to the National Association of Evangelicals, which was a really important evangelical Christian organization. So I've done research in over 50 archival collections. I've used about 200 different individual collections to amass the research for the book. Going into the research, if anything surprised me, it was actually the extent to which the family was a central political metaphor, a central political icon for liberalism. I think I went into the project expecting that I would find the family to be central to a post-1960s conservative politics. But what surprised me was how central the family was to a liberal politics as well. That was something I had not really anticipated, the power and strength and compelling nature of that image of the family within liberalism in the middle decades of the 20th century. Whether we're still in a pattern of political debates about the family, I think is a very interesting question. This past election in 2012 revealed, at least in the Republican primaries, that the so-called culture wars are still very much present and still have a very compelling grip on at least part of the electorate in the United States. But studies since 2012, the election of 2012, polling that's been done, especially with younger voters, reveals that the culture wars issues, the wars over family, over gender, over women's roles, over sexuality, that these have a less compelling grip on that younger generation, that they're not as moved by these questions. And so one does have to wonder whether this is something that will recede into the past, or whether we'll continue to have in our politics these fights every 2 or 3 years. If there was one thing that I would urge viewers to take away, or readers to take away from the book, it's the way in which something as elemental to everyone's life as the family, and the way we organize ourselves in terms of families, that this can actually be a really critical lens for understanding much deeper and broader political trends and political turmoil. So that if we use the family as a kind of historical lens and focus on the period from the 1960s to the present, the last half century or so, that lens can tell us a lot about how we as a country move from a relatively liberal political era to a much more conservative political era. Now, whether that is changing. We're here in the shadow of the 2012 election. We don't know yet. I think it's still too early to tell. But certainly the last generation or two of American politics have been dominated by a more conservative orientation of the whole political culture. And I think using the family, something that we're all familiar with and comfortable with as a lens, can really tell us a lot about that transformation.